guys. You're making it. You're almost there. So the endocrine system and the nervous system work together to help maintain homeostasis, help keep that constant internal environment. These two systems coordinate communication. They make changes accordingly via impulses and those neurotransmitters. A key difference between endocrine and nervous is that the endocrine system may have a little bit longer lasting effect. So endocrine means internal secretion, and the endocrine system is a collection of endocrine glands that secrete substances. Endo means inside, so endocrine glands secrete to the internal environment, in other words, to bodily fluids. They secrete hormones that go through the bloodstream to affect target cells, which are usually far away. Paracrine and autocrine function as messenger molecules, and sometimes we call those local hormones. Exocrine glands secrete to ducts that go to the outside of the body. So exo, exit, endo inside, exo outside. So that's a very important distinction there. So they secrete, they go to the ducts that secrete to the outside of the body. A sweat gland is a good example of an exocrine gland. Sweat is released through a duct that goes outside of the body, or the stomach acid in the digestive tract is an exocrine secretion. Exocrine glands differ from endocrine glands in that the exocrine glands secrete through ducts or tubes to the body's exterior. So exocrine glands are going to deliver their products directly to a specific site. Endocrine are more going to secrete hormones into the bloodstream, and then they act on specific cells instead of a specific site. We've also got some similar glands to endocrine that can be called paracrine or autocrine, and we call those quasi-endocrine. So they're similar to endocrine. So both the endocrine and nervous system use chemical signals. The nervous system releases those neurotransmitters to synapse, where the endocrine system releases hormones into the bloodstream. So they virtually can go anywhere because the blood pretty much goes almost everywhere. The endocrine system is specific, however, because only target cells have receptors to respond to these messenger molecules. Paracrine and autocrine are also specific. A hormone is a molecule that has a metabolic effect on another cell, and the target cell is a cell that has receptors that are specific to those hormones, and so they fit specifically together. That's where we're seeing that shape determining the function here. Receptors have glycoproteins. Remember, those are sugar proteins that fit specific hormones. Cells that have an increase in the number of those receptors that are available for binding, we call that to be upregulated. So they can increase that cells, and we call that upregulation. A few important points on this slide is the type of signal, speed, and duration. And so for the nervous system, so the endocrine system is a regulator. It helps regulate metabolic processes by controlling the rate of chemical reactions. It transports or helps to transport substances, or controlling the rate of transport, I should say, helps control the rate of water balance regulation, electrolyte balance, and even blood pressure. Has effects on all of those things. The endocrine hormones can also affect reproduction, growth, and development. Hormones that the posterior pituitary secrete are made or synthesized in the hypothalamus. Hyperparathyroidism, so a hyperparathyroid, can stimulate excessive osteoclast activity. So if you have more osteoclast, don't you remember the difference between the osteoclast and the osteoblast? Then if you have more osteoclast activity, it can cause bones to soften. That is most often caused by a tumor of the parathyroid. And this can increase the risk of spontaneous fractures. So you could see somebody come in with several fractures at an age that they shouldn't have anything like that happen on a repeated event, or repetition of events. So in addition to a drop in blood calcium concentration, a symptom of hypoparathyroidism could be muscle cramps. Hormones regulate metabolism. That is so important that we regulate our metabolism. especially when it comes to growth, reproduction, and development, because we can have so many problems when these things don't function correctly. The nervous system, again, remember, releases those neurotransmitters into the synapses. By contrast, the endocrine releases them to the bloodstream. So the specificity of that hormone action comes from those target cell receptors, okay? So what receptors you have is going to determine what neurotransmitters and what hormones are going to be taken in and utilized. Here you can see how these hormones are released into these extracellular spaces, all right? And then they can get into the bloodstream and travel to the rest of the body. So hormones are those organic compounds, which means they're long hydrocarbon chains, and then they sometimes have functional groups on them. And they're classified as either steroid or steroid-like and non-steroid. So remember that steroids are lipids, and those are made from cholesterol. And then we're going to include our steroid-like substances there, and that is going to be things like our sex hormones, testosterone, and estrogen, and then aldosterone and cortisol or some others. Non-steroid hormones are going to be things like our amines. Amines are protein-based, and those include norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is basically the same thing as noradrenaline and adrenaline. So remember, that's the hormone that affects you if you get in a wreck, or you almost get in a wreck and everything amps up. That's from that adrenaline, okay? So these are made in the adrenal medulla. And hormones made by the anterior pituitary. And when we're talking about hormones, you need to pay attention to, is it posterior pituitary or anterior pituitary, okay? So don't just read the word pituitary. You got to make the distinction between anterior and posterior. And so these are made by those anterior pituitary and also some in the parathyroid glands. And so, of course, protein hormones, remember, those are made of amino acids that are folded into specific shapes. And then we have some glycoproteins. Remember, that's a protein with a sugar added, and those are also secreted from the anterior pituitary. Those peptide hormones, or the short amino acid chains, those are associated with posterior pituitary in the hypothalamus. And then lastly, we have prostaglandins, and those are paracrine substances, and those actually regulate neighboring cells. These are lipids made from a fatty acid, which is kind of similar to what's in the cell membrane. These are used in many cells like the liver, kidney, thymus, pancreas, and even reproductive organs. So these are some different structural formulas for some of these hormones. So here on A, we have the steroid hormone cortisol. And that helps to regulate metabolism and immune or stress responses. And so you've probably heard a lot about health and having cortisol in your system in excess and how that can put weight on. And so that's in excess. So you want to keep your stress levels. There's a healthy stress and a non-healthy stress, and when you have that non-healthy stress on a continual basis, it does set these hormones off to be imbalanced. Then we have an amine hormone, which is norepinephrine, and that is going to be this one right here, okay? Norepinephrine, remember that is also called noradrenaline. This is the neurotransmitter to mobilize the brain and the body for that fight or flight action. It increases the force of skeletal muscle contraction and the rate force of cardiac contraction and output. And so that's why I was talking about, this is often what you feel whenever you almost get in a car accident and your heart starts pumping. And, you know, of course, we say we have those adrenaline junkies that like that feeling. I'm not one of those that likes that feeling. But that's where this is coming from. All right, so then we have next the amino acid sequence of proteins forming this hormone that we often call PTH, or parathyroid hormones. Parathyroid hormones, which regulates serum calcium for the bone, kidney, and intestines. We have a peptide hormone, oxytocin, you might be familiar with. Oxytocin. What is oxytocin responsible for? Well, one of the things we're most familiar with it being responsible for is uterine contractions. Uterine contractions. And then here, this is the prostaglandin. So anyway, that's just some of the different structures of what they look like. So this is a good summary slide of some of the different hormone names, the abbreviations, and some of their synonyms. You know, for some reason we can't have one name for things in science. It's not complicated enough. We got to have 2 or 3 names, okay? But so this is a good chart to look at. All right, so the posterior pituitary, you can see here, it is responsible for ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And the function of this is it causes reabsorption of water in the kidney. And so this is tied to blood pressure. Then we have the pancreas as another example here. It's a good one to know, which helps regulate insulin and glucose. And so it's got receptors open on the cell membrane, glucose, and allows glucose to flow into the cell. So it helps to regulate glucose. Then we have the anterior pituitary and prolactin. Prolactin. What does prolactin do? Prolactin stimulates mammary glands. What is lactin? Think lactose. Milk sugar, right? Milk protein is lactin, okay? You can also think lactation. And then the posterior pituitary, oxytocin, we already said it is responsible for uterine contraction, but this is also if you've had a baby and you've nursed and you're standing in the grocery store and you have left your child with someone for a while and you hear a baby cry, what happens? And you may not know this if you haven't had kids, but you might be familiar with it. You have a milk letdown response, which can be a bad thing if you're out in public and you're not ready for that and you don't have your child with you, okay? And so, but that causes the milk letdown response. And so it stimulates those muscles to release the milk produced when the baby is ready to eat. Then we have the adrenal medulla and epinephrine. This works with Silic A&P. It increases the activity of the enzyme that breaks down glycogen and increases glucose in the blood. So this works alongside with the pancreas as well. So let's look at an example of the sequence of steroid hormone action. Steroid and thyroid hormones are water insoluble. That's because they are formed from cholesterol. What is cholesterol? It's a fat, right? And fats are nonpolar. Water is polar, and so the two don't mix, right? We know water and oil don't mix, but it's because they're polar and nonpolar. But steroid and thyroid hormones can go through the lipid bilayer because they are made from lipids. Cholesterol is made from a lipid, and so they can enter the cells. Once they're in the cell, they bind to a protein receptor, then the steroid and thyroid hormones form what we call a hormone receptor complex, okay? And you can see that we're going through the lipid bilayer. This is the cell membrane here, the bilayer here. Down here is the, oh, it did show up there, hormone receptor complex, okay? All right, so we have the hormone receptor complex, which activates transcription of mRNA here, okay, which is going to enter the cytoplasm and actually facilitate and direct protein synthesis. Sometimes they can, these can repress or inhibit a gene and prevent it from being transcribed. An example of this is aldosterone. Aldosterone, that is released from the adrenal gland, and it stimulates the kidneys to hold on to sodium by making more sodium potassium pumps, okay? So remember, sodium potassium pumps change the concentration of sodium and potassium inside and outside of the cell. They normally help to regulate that and send it back to normal. Cell responses to a steroid or high thyroid hormone is going to be directly related to the number of those hormone receptor complexes that form. Okay, so the number of receptors you have, obviously the number of hormones you can let in. All right, so CAMP can act kind of as a second messenger. A hormone is going to bind to its receptor, and the hormone receptor complex can then activate what we call a G protein, and then that can activate something like adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase is an integral membrane protein that has an active site on it on the inside of the cell. So remember, an active site is basically where the action happens. So it can remove 2 phosphates from ATP, forming C-A&P or Silic A&P. And Silic A&P is going to activate protein kinases, and these are enzymes. Kinases transfer phosphate groups between proteins and different substrates. Remember, substrates are basically just what we're wanting to work on in the body. So they can phosphorylate. Kinases are big phosphorylators in the body. I don't mean big in size. I mean they do it a lot. So this is the process that is actually used to turn different mechanism and activities on and off in our body. So if you were ever to take, say, a biochemistry class, you would learn all about all the different things that protein kinase actually turns on and off. So it's basically kind of like a light switch. It's a really pretty cool way that the body is able to control things. CA&P is needed for hormones to be released from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary. And these are going to be things like TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ADH, which is our antidiuretic hormone, which is related to our blood pressure, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormones, and these are related to our reproductive cycles, parathyroid hormones, calcitonin, and so many others. So CA&P and protein kinases here are really important in the body, and so is that adenylate cyclase. So here's another action example here, action of the hormones, and these are non-steroid hormones. Using that Silic A&P. So this is an important example. Silic A&P is very important in the body. And yes, I know, I said very important a whole lot. All right, so protein kinases can activate a protein substrate molecule, which causes a change in the hormone's effects. The response of a cell to a hormone is then going to be determined by the type of membrane receptor and protein substrate molecule present in the cell. And so here at 1, we see we have an endocrine gland secreting a non-steroid hormone. Body fluid will carry it from the extracellular through the extracellular fluid to the target cell. And it knows the target cell here because of what? Because of what specific receptor that its shape actually fits that particular hormone, okay? So I hope you see why I have really focused and said over and over again that shape determines function. So that's how it knows how to get where it's supposed to go. It's because they're going to match like puzzle pieces, okay? And so then the hormone combines with the receptor. It docks in on the receptor on the target cell, and it activates this G protein. Adenyl cyclase then, which is over here, can be activated in the target cell's membrane. You'll notice this is the membrane here, so it's actually lying in the membrane. And then it is going to convert ATP into Silic A&P. Okay, so CA&P. Silic A&P then is going to activate a kinase. And so you have an inactive form and an active form. And the way that switches from active to inactive is by sticking a phosphate on or taking it off. Okay, and so that's how we activate things. We stick a phosphate on, we take a phosphate off. Okay, that's the light switch, up and down. So protein kinases activate protein substrates then, and so we're going on this next step here, and make them active or inactive. And that is what triggers the change in a metabolic process, okay? And that can produce then the hormones effect. So this is a cascade of events, and it's got some checks and balances here, and we have ways that we can trigger and turn things on and off, and that is really important because you don't just, would you want adrenaline running through your body all of the time? Can you imagine? I mean, think back to the last time you actually had a surge of adrenaline in your body when you were really scared and your heart was pounding and you were shaking. Think about how hard that would be just on your organs, okay? That would be really, really hard on your body. You don't want to have these hormones, or if you're a woman, think about when you are having your menstrual cycle and how hormonal you are. You want that all the time, right? So we need to be able to turn these things off and on as needed. And also it's wasteful if we were just going to constantly have them running. It's like turning your lights off at the house. If you're not using them, you want to turn them off. So prostaglandins act locally in a small amount. They are made just before release, and they inactivate quickly, so they're very, very short-lived. Prostaglandins regulate responses to hormones, activate and inactivate the adenylate cyclase, in turn regulating production, of course, of that A&P. The actions include relaxing muscles in the lungs, dilating blood vessels, uterine contractions, and inhibition of hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Effects of sodium ion water balance. It affects and helps to regulate blood pressure and promote inflammation in an injured tissue. Prostaglandins' function is important also in pain relief with drugs like aspirin, and its mechanism, how they work, and some steroids as well. So these substances can also in turn alter prostaglandin activity. So for homeostasis to work, again, we've got to be able to turn these processes on and off. Think about that skeletal muscle contraction. If it's not turned off by that removal of acetylcholine, we'll have constant contraction, which would be extremely painful. Hormones have different half-lives, and that's the time that it takes for half the hormone molecule, I should say, to be removed from your blood plasma. That's the half-life. So some are going to stay there much longer and have a longer acting effect. Some need to last a long time, and others only need to last a very short time. And so negative feedback is the main way that hormone secretion is regulated. Okay. Remember that negative feedback is moving something back towards the set point. We do have that positive feedback, but that's rare in the body. Remember, our example for that is like childbirth. So here's that feedback loop here. Hormone levels rise, and the hormones are going to exert their effects. Negative feedback is going to inhibit the secretion of the hormone. As hormone levels decrease, that inhibition is going to be lifted, and secretion of the hormone will begin. This keeps the hormone close to that cell, just like thermostat. Endocrine glands detect changes in concentrations of hormones. They also help process hormone controls or the action of that the hormone has on the internal environment. The hypothalamus is going to control the anterior pituitary and tell it when to release things like tropic hormones, stimulate other endocrine glands to release hormones. And then, of course, the nervous system also stimulates some glands like the adrenal medulla. So these guys work kind of hand in hand, the thalamus and hypothalamus, and nervous system. So the nervous system can stimulate the adrenal medulla. It can secrete hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine to get us that fight or flight response. Some glands respond directly to changes in the internal environment themselves. If blood glucose rises, for instance, the pancreas will automatically secrete insulin, and if they fail, it's going to secrete glucagon. It's going to cause that storage. So this is the end of part 1. Have a great afternoon.